"Oh no, 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 this can't be happening." Jenna's voice trembled as she rushed forward, her boots crunching against the dry leaves that had fallen overnight. The early morning sun had barely begun to peek through the trees, but she could see enough to know something was wrong. Her golden retriever mix, Rusty, had his paws perched on the mossy edge of the old well behind their farmhouse, staring down into the darkness with an intensity that sent chills through her. Rusty had been acting strange since the night before, pacing around the backyard, sniffing at the air, his ears perked up at every sound. Jenna thought maybe a raccoon had wandered too close to the property, or a deer had passed through, but this was different. The dog wasn't just interested in the well, he was fixated on it, as if drawn by some invisible force. "Rusty, come here, boy," Jenna called, her voice firmer now. The last thing she needed was her dog tumbling in. He didn't budge. His tail wagged slightly, but his body remained still. A deep, low whine escaped him. Heart pounding, Jenna swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped forward. When she reached the well, she placed a hand on Rusty's back, feeling his rapid breathing beneath his thick fur. Then she looked inside and froze. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think. Her breath hitched in her chest as her eyes adjusted to the dimness below. At first, all she saw were shadows, a few glistening stones where the morning light barely reached. But then, a shape. Something was down there. Jenna's stomach twisted as she peered closer. It wasn't an animal, wasn't just some debris or fallen branch. It was a child. She barely registered the sound of her own voice when she gasped, "Oh my, there's someone in there!" The boy, because now that her eyes had adjusted, she could tell it was a boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was huddled against the damp, moss-covered stones. His small hands clutched the rough wall of the well, his wide, frightened eyes looking straight up at her. He was breathing, moving, but barely. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, and his clothes were damp and torn. Jenna spun around, searching for her phone. She'd left it on the porch. "Stay here, Rusty. Watch him," she ordered, as if the dog understood every word. And maybe he did, because he didn't move from his post. Racing back to the house, Jenna took the porch steps 2 at a time and grabbed her phone from the wooden railing. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911. Come on, pick up!" "911, what's your emergency?" a calm female voice answered. "There's a child in the well behind my house. He's alive, but I don't know how long he's been there. He needs help." "Ma'am, stay with me. What's your address?" Jenna rattled it off, her voice rising with panic. "Please, send someone fast. He looks so weak." "Emergency responders are on their way. Stay with him, but do not attempt to go down the well yourself. Can you talk to him?" Jenna ran back as fast as she could, her pulse hammering in her ears. Rusty was still at the well, whining softly. "I'm here, buddy," she murmured to the dog, then turned her attention back to the boy. "Hey, sweetheart. Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" The boy shifted slightly, his small frame trembling. "I'm cold." His voice was barely above a whisper. Okay, just hang in there. Help is coming. What's your name?" "Ethan." Jenna's throat tightened. "Ethan, that's a great name. My name's Jenna, and this here is Rusty. He's the one who found you. You like dogs?" A tiny nod. Good. Rusty's a hero today, buddy. You just hold on. They're coming, okay?" Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Jenna heard the wail of sirens in the distance, relief flooding her chest. She kept talking, even when Ethan didn't respond much, just to make sure he stayed awake. Soon, flashing red and blue lights filled the yard, and paramedics rushed forward, followed by firefighters carrying ropes and harnesses. Jenna stepped back, pulling Rusty with her as they worked. Her hands shook as she watched them lower a firefighter into the well. She could hear them speaking gently to Ethan, coaxing him to stay still as they secured him. Then, after what felt like forever, they pulled him up. Ethan's tiny frame was wrapped in a warm blanket before he was whisked onto a stretcher. His eyes flickered open, and for a moment he locked gazes with Jenna. "Rusty found me," he murmured. Tears pricked at Jenna's eyes. "Yeah, he sure did, buddy. He's a good boy." A paramedic placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did good calling us so fast. He's severely dehydrated and weak, but he'll be okay. If he'd been down there much longer..." Jenna didn't need them to finish the sentence. She swallowed the lump in her throat and looked down at Rusty, scratching behind his ears. "You saved him, Rusty. You really did." The golden retriever wagged his tail, his eyes never leaving the small boy who was now being loaded into the ambulance. As the vehicle pulled away, Jenna let out a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around Rusty's neck. "I don't know how you knew, but you did. You're a real hero, boy." Rusty leaned into her, pressing his warm, golden fur against her, and for the first time that morning, Jenna let herself smile. The story wasn't over. There were still so many questions. How did Ethan get there? Where were his parents? But for now, all that mattered was that he was safe, and that Rusty, the dog Jenna had rescued, had just saved a life in return. Rusty barely left Jenna's side after that morning. Even as Ethan was safely transported to the hospital and the ambulance disappeared from view, the golden retriever seemed to know the story wasn't over. Jenna found herself glancing at him every few minutes, as if he could offer answers just by looking back. But all he could do was wag his tail and nudge her hand with his nose. She spent the rest of the day at home, restless and preoccupied. The news spread quickly through the small town. Word traveled fast when a child was pulled out of an old well by first responders. Neighbors dropped by, some bringing casseroles, others asking for details. Each time, Jenna explained the same thing. Rusty had found Ethan. She hadn't even known there was a child missing. All she could think about now was the boy's pale, frightened face as he was lifted to safety. "He was lucky," one neighbor said, shaking her head. "That well's been here forever. No one would have thought to look there." Jenna nodded, her gaze drifting back to Rusty. "If it weren't for him, I don't even want to think about what would have happened." By the following day, Jenna decided she needed to visit Ethan at the hospital. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a pull, an instinct she couldn't ignore. She wanted to see that he was okay. She wanted to know how he'd ended up there in the first place. At the small county hospital, Jenna found Ethan's room on the second floor. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching a small stuffed bear she'd picked up on her way. The boy was propped up in bed, his thin frame covered by a crisp white blanket. His face still looked pale, but the color was beginning to return to his cheeks. A woman in her early 30s sat by his bedside. Ethan's mother, Jenna assumed. Her eyes red and tired. Jenna cleared her throat softly. "Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm the one who found him." The mother looked up, startled at first, then softened when she saw the bear in Jenna's hands. Oh, thank you. Please, come in." Jenna stepped into the room, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. "I just wanted to see how he's doing." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. He's doing better. The doctor said he was dehydrated and exhausted, but there's no serious injury. He's lucky. So lucky. Jenna swallowed hard. I'm glad to hear that. I brought him this. I thought he might like it. She handed the bear to Ethan, who took it with a small smile. Thank you, he said softly. Jenna's chest tightened. You're welcome, buddy. Ethan's mother turned to Jenna, her expression a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. How did you even find him? They said he was in that well for hours. Jenna glanced down, her hand brushing Rusty's collar as if the dog were still beside her. It wasn't me. It was Rusty, my dog. He wouldn't stop staring at that well. I wouldn't have even looked if it weren't for him. The woman's lip trembled. Please tell Rusty thank you for me. I don't know what we would have done without him. As Jenna walked out of the hospital room, her thoughts swirled. Ethan was safe now, but the question that had been gnawing at her since yesterday still lingered. How had he ended up in that well in the first place? She remembered the condition of his clothes, ripped and damp. The boy had been scared, but there was something else in his eyes, something Jenna couldn't quite place. He hadn't talked much, just gave his name and said he was cold. Who had been with him before he fell? Where had he come from? The following days were a blur of news reports and phone calls. A local reporter came by to interview Jenna and Rusty, hoping to capture the heartwarming story for the evening news. The article in the town's paper praised Rusty's keen instincts and described how the heroic dog had saved a life. It brought attention to the well, which no one had thought about in years. The old stones and moss-covered bricks seemed harmless enough until they weren't. It was during one of those quiet mornings, after the news trucks left and the calls stopped coming, that Jenna decided to take a closer look at the well. Something about it gnawed at her. She had no plans to climb down. She wasn't reckless, but she wanted to see it in the daylight, to understand what had drawn Rusty there in the first place. As she approached, Rusty followed close behind, his ears twitching at every sound. The area around the well was damp and shaded, with thick tree roots curling through the soil. Jenna peered over the edge again. Even though the well was empty now, she couldn't shake the feeling that it held more secrets than she'd first realized. You knew, she murmured to Rusty. You knew he was down there. How? Rusty wagged his tail, his eyes fixed on hers, as if urging her to keep looking. Jenna crouched down, running her hand over the stones. The well was old, probably over 100 years, built back when the farmhouse was first constructed. Its edges were worn smooth in places, but there were also sharp, jagged spots where the stones had shifted over time. She noticed a small piece of fabric caught on one of the stones. It was pale blue and frayed, the same color as Ethan's torn shirt. Her stomach tightened. You must have fallen, she said aloud, her voice low. But how did you get here? Who were you with? She couldn't stop her mind from wandering. Had Ethan been playing near the well and slipped? Was someone supposed to be watching him? The idea that a child could be so close to danger without anyone noticing sent a shiver down her spine. The next few weeks passed uneventfully. Jenna went back to her routine, but Rusty remained unusually attentive. He stayed close to her, almost as if he feared something else might happen. It was comforting and unsettling at the same time. She couldn't shake the feeling that the well still had more stories to tell. One afternoon, a woman from the County Historical Society came by. She introduced herself as Margaret and explained that she'd read about Rusty's heroic rescue in the newspaper. She was curious about the well, as it was a part of the property's original design. "I've been researching old wells in the area," Margaret said, flipping through a notebook filled with handwritten notes. "Most of them were sealed off or fell into disrepair, but yours, it's quite unique." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "Unique?" Margaret nodded. "It's deeper than most, and there's evidence it was used for more than just drawing water. Back in the 8 to 1800s, wells like this sometimes served as emergency storage for valuables, or even as hiding spots during raids." Jenna's curiosity piqued. Hiding spots. During conflicts, people would sometimes lower important documents or family heirlooms into the well for safekeeping. It was risky, but if no one else knew the well was there, it could be quite effective. The idea sent a chill through Jenna. Could that be why Ethan ended up in the well? Was someone looking for something down there? Or was it just an unfortunate accident, a relic of a time long past intersecting with the present in the worst possible way? Margaret continued. "I also found records of a family who lived here in the late 19th century. Their youngest son went missing for a day and was found at the bottom of the well. Thankfully, he survived, but it was quite the ordeal. Maybe something about this place." Her voice trailed off. Jenna glanced at Rusty, who was lying at her feet, alert as ever. "Maybe," she murmured. Margaret left with a promise to send over any additional information she uncovered. Jenna was grateful, but the unease still lingered. That night, as she sat on the porch with Rusty by her side, the quiet of the countryside seemed heavier than usual. The stars above were clear and bright, but the darkness around the well felt deeper, more profound. Rusty's head rested on her lap, his eyes half closed, but his ears still twitched at the slightest sound. As Jenna stared out into the night, she couldn't help but wonder if the well's secrets would ever truly be unearthed, or if some mysteries were best left in the shadows. One thing she knew for certain: Rusty had saved a life, and he wasn't done protecting the ones he loved. The next morning dawned calm and quiet, the kind of early autumn day that made Jenna love living in the countryside. Rusty, ever the early riser, had already padded out to the porch by the time she got up. He sat patiently, ears swiveling toward every rustle in the grass, as if standing watch over the farm and everything around it. Jenna stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, and gave him a fond smile. "Good morning, Rusty. Ready to patrol the yard?" He turned his head at her voice, his tail wagging. If she hadn't seen him that day by the well, so determined and intense, she might never have believed her laid-back rescue dog had such a heroic side. But now she saw him differently. She trusted his instincts more than ever. That's why, when he bounded off the porch and stopped by the edge of the woods, Jenna followed. It was one of those mornings when the world felt unusually still. The leaves were just beginning to turn, a few golden and crimson flecks mixing in with the green. Jenna felt the coolness of the dew-soaked grass through her boots as she made her way toward the spot where Rusty had stopped. His nose was to the ground, tail straight out, a sure sign he'd picked up on something. "What is it, boy?" Jenna asked. "Did something wander through here last night?" Rusty sniffed again, then looked up at her and barked. Just once, not a frantic, alarming bark, but a short, purposeful one. Then he started walking, looking back every few steps to make sure she was following. Jenna couldn't help but laugh under her breath. "All right, Rusty, lead the way." He guided her along a faint path that wound through the trees. Jenna hadn't gone far into this part of the property since moving here. It was mostly wild, untouched land beyond the old well, and she'd always been more focused on fixing up the house and barn than exploring the woods. But now, curiosity and trust in her dog spurred her on. As they walked, the canopy above grew thicker, and the sounds of the farm faded away. The rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird replaced the hum of the house's electrical wiring or the distant whir of a tractor. The air smelled rich and earthy, damp from the morning dew. Rusty stopped suddenly, his body rigid, his nose pointed straight ahead. Jenna stepped beside him and squinted through the trees. At first, she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just tall oaks, a few sprawling maples, and patches of dense underbrush. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, she spotted it. A narrow, well-worn trail that didn't look like it was made by deer or other animals. It was too defined, too straight. "Well, what do you know?" she murmured. "Guess someone's been walking out here." Rusty wagged his tail, as if pleased that she'd noticed. Jenna considered the trail for a moment. It was odd. She'd never seen anyone near her property, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. She hadn't even heard of hunters or hikers using this land. The thought sent a small shiver down her spine. It could be harmless, she told herself. Maybe an old logging path, or a forgotten boundary marker. Whatever it was, Rusty seemed intent on following it. He stepped onto the trail and looked back at her again. Jenna hesitated. She knew she should be working. There were still plenty of repairs needed around the house, not to mention the pile of invoices she'd been ignoring on her kitchen counter. But something about Rusty's demeanor urged her forward. Just a quick look, she thought. If it's nothing, I'll turn back. They followed the trail deeper into the woods, the trees growing taller and closer together. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in dappled patches, illuminating moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. Rusty trotted ahead, occasionally pausing to sniff the air. Jenna kept her eyes on the ground, watching for roots and uneven spots, but her mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading toward something important. After several minutes, the trail opened up into a small clearing. Jenna stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. In the center of the clearing was a dilapidated cabin. Its wooden walls were gray with age, the roof sagging under the weight of years' worth of debris. The windows were broken, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. Ivy and vines crept up the sides, reclaiming the structure for the forest. Rusty barked again, his tail wagging furiously. He darted toward the cabin, stopping just short of the porch. Jenna hurried after him, her heart pounding. The cabin looked abandoned, but the path leading here suggested it hadn't always been. Someone had come here once, maybe recently, maybe long ago. She climbed the creaking steps and peered through one of the broken windows. Inside, the cabin was dark and cluttered. Old furniture, now covered in dust and cobwebs, sat askew on the uneven floor. Shelves lined the walls, some still holding jars and cans whose labels had long since faded. A few torn curtains fluttered in the faint breeze. Jenna tried the door. It resisted at first, but with a firm push, it swung open. Rusty darted inside, sniffing everything, his nose leading him from one corner to another. Jenna stepped in cautiously, her boots stirring up little clouds of dust. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. The cabin was just one large room, with a stone fireplace at the far end and a small kitchen area to the left. An old iron bed frame stood in one corner, the mattress long gone. Jenna took it all in, trying to piece together who might have lived here and why they'd left. It didn't feel like a vacation cabin. It felt purposeful, but she couldn't quite say why. She walked to the fireplace and noticed something unusual, a small stack of neatly arranged firewood beside the hearth. It didn't look old or rotted. In fact, it looked freshly cut. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been here recently. "Rusty, come here," she called softly. The dog trotted over, wagging his tail as if he'd found some great treasure. Jenna knelt down, stroking his fur as her mind raced. What did this mean? She had always thought of this land as private, untouched. But clearly she'd been wrong. And if someone was coming out here, cutting firewood, maintaining this path, what did they want? Did they know about Ethan? Did they know about the well? A chill ran down her spine. She decided not to linger. As fascinating as this discovery was, she didn't feel comfortable staying any longer. She led Rusty out of the cabin, pulling the door shut behind her, and began the walk back to the house. Rusty seemed content, trotting along happily, but Jenna couldn't shake the sense of unease. She knew she'd have to come back to the cabin, maybe bring someone with her, to figure out what was going on. But for now, she just wanted to get home. By the time they returned to the porch, the sun was higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the yard. Jenna sat down on the steps, her mind still buzzing. Rusty lay beside her, his head resting on his paws, as if he'd done his job for the day and was ready to relax. Jenna reached down to scratch behind his ears. "Good boy," she murmured. "You always know what's out there, don't you?" Rusty wagged his tail, his eyes half closed in contentment. Jenna smiled, but the questions kept turning over in her mind. The well, the boy, the cabin. None of it made sense yet. But she had a feeling Rusty wasn't done leading her down these paths. And somehow, she knew she wasn't done following him. The evening brought a soft drizzle that pattered against the windows of Jenna's farmhouse. She found herself sitting at the kitchen table, the dim glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Rusty lay curled up at her feet, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. As she absent-mindedly pushed her pen across a notepad, the unanswered questions from the day hung heavily in the air. Who had been tending that cabin? Why was the firewood freshly cut, the path so well trodden? She thought of Ethan's small, frightened face, and couldn't shake the feeling that the two mysteries were connected. But how? Jenna tried calling Margaret from the Historical Society again. She'd left a voicemail earlier, asking if Margaret knew anything more about the cabin or if she had found any old records that might shed some light. The woman hadn't returned her call yet, and the waiting only fueled Jenna's restlessness. "Rusty," she said aloud, her voice cutting through the quiet kitchen. "What do you think? Are we supposed to go back?" The dog lifted his head, his brown eyes meeting hers. He thumped his tail once against the floor, then settled back down, as if to say, "When you're ready." After a restless night, Jenna woke early. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside fresh and still. A light mist hung over the fields, and the air smelled of wet grass and turned earth. Jenna made her decision over her first cup of coffee. She would return to the cabin, but this time she'd bring her friend Rachel. Rachel was a longtime friend who lived about an hour away. They'd met in college and stayed close over the years. Jenna knew Rachel would bring both level-headedness and a sense of adventure. Qualities that were exactly what she needed right now. By mid-morning, Rachel's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, a smile on her face, but Jenna could tell she was intrigued by the urgency in Jenna's voice when she'd called. "What's the big mystery?" Rachel asked, stretching her arms after the drive. "It's not just one mystery," Jenna said, leading her inside to explain everything. She told Rachel about finding Ethan, Rusty's strange behavior, the well, and finally, the abandoned cabin. Rachel listened closely, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "That is a lot," Rachel said when Jenna finished. "I can see why you're on edge, but what do you think we're going to find out there today?" "I don't know," Jenna admitted. "But something about that cabin isn't sitting right with me. Someone's been out there recently. I just want to get a closer look, and maybe you'll see something I missed." Rachel nodded. "Okay, let's check it out. If nothing else, I'll get to stretch my legs." The two women set off with Rusty leading the way. The dog seemed even more eager this time, his nose low to the ground as he retraced the path from the day before. Jenna felt a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety as they moved deeper into the woods. She'd only been to the cabin once, but already it felt like a place that held too many secrets. When they reached the clearing, Rachel stopped short. "Whoa," she said. "You weren't kidding. This place looks like it's been pulled straight out of some old ghost story." Jenna followed her gaze. In the daylight, the cabin looked even more decrepit, the weathered wood and broken windows adding to its eerie charm. But it also felt less abandoned than she remembered. A few more logs had been stacked by the door, and the path around the cabin was slightly more cleared than before. Someone had definitely been here. "See what I mean?" Jenna said. "It's like someone's taking care of it, just enough to keep it from falling apart." Rachel nodded, stepping closer. "Let's have a look inside." The two of them entered cautiously. The air inside was heavy and still, carrying that same faint scent of decay. Jenna could see Rachel's nose wrinkle as she took in the cluttered space. "This isn't just an old hunting cabin," Rachel said, picking up a dusty jar from one of the shelves. "It's got more personality. Whoever stayed here left more than just a sleeping bag and some canned food. This was lived in." Jenna agreed. There were small touches that hinted at a life once lived here. A photograph faded beyond recognition stuck to the wall, a weathered book with yellowing pages left on the table, a child's toy truck tucked into a corner. "Do you think this was Ethan's family's cabin?" Rachel asked. Jenna hesitated. "It's possible, but he never mentioned it. He didn't say much at all, actually, just his name and that he was cold. I couldn't ask him where he came from or how he ended up in that well." Rachel walked over to the fireplace and examined the stack of firewood. "These logs are fresh. Somebody's keeping this place ready. Maybe they left in a hurry and haven't come back yet. Or maybe they're coming and going when we're not looking," Jenna said. "That's what I'm afraid of." Rachel turned to her friend, her expression serious. "What are you thinking? That someone put Ethan in that well on purpose?" "I don't know," Jenna admitted, her voice low. "But the timing is just strange. Rusty led me to that well right when Ethan needed help. What if Rusty wasn't just finding Ethan? What if he was picking up on something or someone else?" The thought hung between them, heavy and unsettling. Rachel shook her head. "If there's more to this, we need more information. You said you've been trying to get a hold of that historical society woman. If anyone knows about this cabin or who lived here, it's her." Jenna nodded. "I'll keep trying to reach her. And in the meantime, we watch our step," Rachel finished for her, "and keep a close eye on Rusty." The women left the cabin, their thoughts no clearer than when they arrived. The walk back felt quieter somehow, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. Rusty stayed close, his ears flicking back at every sound. By the time they reached the farmhouse, Rachel had that look of determination Jenna knew well. "I'll do some digging," Rachel said. "If someone's been using that cabin, there's got to be a record somewhere. Property deeds, old maps, something. I'll let you know if I find anything." Jenna was grateful. "Thanks, Rachel. I just need to know what's going on. It's not just curiosity anymore. It's more than that. Rachel gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading to her car. As Jenna watched her friend drive away, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Rachel would uncover something that could make sense of it all. That evening, Jenna sat on the porch again, staring out at the fields. Rusty lay at her feet, his warm presence a comfort against the encroaching night. She reached down, running her fingers through his thick fur. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" she asked softly. Rusty didn't respond, of course. He just sighed, a contented sound, and rested his head on her foot. Jenna smiled, but her thoughts remained restless. She knew this was far from over. Jenna awoke the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The questions that had lingered in her mind like a mist were no closer to being answered. But she couldn't let that stop her from digging deeper. Rusty, ever her shadow, trailed after her as she went about her chores, his steady presence a constant reminder of the strange events that had unfolded. The farmhouse felt quieter than usual, the ticking clock in the kitchen louder against the silence. Jenna tried to focus on her tasks, feeding the chickens, checking the garden, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin and the unanswered mysteries surrounding it. She knew Rachel would be following up on the property records and historical documents, but Jenna felt a pull to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the cabin she hadn't seen, something that would only reveal itself if she looked closely enough. By mid-morning, the sun had burned away the lingering mist, leaving the day bright and crisp. Jenna gathered a flashlight, a notebook, and a sturdy pair of gloves. She knew the cabin's interior was dusty and littered with old debris. She'd need to be careful as she searched. Rusty, sensing her intentions, wagged his tail and followed her to the edge of the woods. "Okay, boy," Jenna said, kneeling to ruffle the fur behind his ears. "Let's go see if we missed anything." The walk to the cabin felt shorter this time, the path more familiar. Jenna moved with purpose, scanning the ground for any signs of recent activity. The leaves underfoot were dry, the air cool and clean. Rusty stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound, but he didn't seem alarmed. When they reached the clearing, Jenna paused to take it all in again. The cabin looked no different than it had the day before, its weathered boards and broken windows telling the same story of abandonment. But now, she knew there was more to it. Someone had been here, and perhaps they'd left something behind, a clue, a hint, a piece of the puzzle that would help her understand how Ethan had ended up in that well. She stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under her boots. Rusty followed, sniffing around the doorway before trotting over to the fireplace. Jenna turned on her flashlight and started her search. She ran the beam along the walls, the floor, the shelves. The room was small, and at first glance it seemed like she'd seen everything before. But as she moved the light slowly across each surface, she began to notice details she'd missed. On one of the shelves, tucked behind a row of dusty jars, was a small tin box. Jenna carefully slid it out, her fingers brushing away the layers of dust. The box was old and battered, the lid held shut by a rusty latch. She pried it open and found a few folded papers inside. She unfolded them slowly, her heart pounding. The first sheet was a handwritten note, the ink faded but still legible. It wasn't signed, but it seemed to be a list of instructions, short, terse phrases that didn't immediately make sense. "Check the stream," one line read. Another said, "Keep the boy quiet." Jenna's pulse quickened as she read. The boy? Was it referring to Ethan? The note gave no context, just these cryptic directives that only deepened the mystery. Beneath the note were 2 more papers. One was a crude map of the area, the cabin marked clearly in the center. Around it were small X's and arrows pointing to different spots in the woods. The other paper looked like an old inventory list, naming tools, canned goods, and other supplies. Nothing on it seemed particularly unusual, but the fact that someone had taken the time to write it down suggested they'd intended to come back. Jenna carefully folded the papers and placed them in her notebook. She'd examine them more closely later. For now, she wanted to keep looking. She moved to the bed frame in the corner, shining her flashlight underneath. The floor was bare except for a few scattered leaves, but as she shifted the light, it caught on something small and metallic wedged between the floorboards. She reached for it, using her gloves to avoid splinters, and pulled out a key. It was old, with a simple iron design, and it didn't look like it fit any modern locks. Jenna held it up, the weight of it heavier than she expected. Another piece of the puzzle, she thought. But what did it open? As she turned the key over in her hand, a sound outside caught her attention. It was faint, but distinct, branches snapping underfoot. Jenna froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She glanced at Rusty, who had also perked up, his ears high and alert. "Someone's out there," she whispered. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the air more tense. Jenna moved to the broken window, peeking out into the clearing. She couldn't see anyone, but the forest was dense, and whoever, or whatever, had made the sound could be just out of view. Rusty growled softly, his body tense. Jenna knew better than to ignore his instincts. She pocketed the key, grabbed her notebook, and slowly backed toward the door. If someone was out there, she didn't want to stick around long enough to find out who. She and Rusty stepped outside, their movements careful and deliberate. Jenna scanned the woods, her eyes darting from tree to tree. The sound had stopped, but her gut told her they weren't alone. She turned toward the path, ready to head back to the farmhouse, when she heard it again. This time, closer. Rusty growled louder, his tail stiff. Jenna's mind raced. Should she call out? Would that make things worse? Before she could decide, a figure emerged from the trees. Jenna's breath caught. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing a worn jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. His expression was unreadable, and he stood there, watching her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Can I help you?" Jenna called, trying to keep her voice steady. The man tilted his head slightly, but didn't respond. After a long moment, he simply turned and disappeared back into the woods, his movements quick and deliberate. Jenna didn't waste another second. She hurried back toward the farmhouse, Rusty by her side. Her mind was racing. Who was that man? Why was he out here? And why hadn't he said anything? When she reached the safety of her porch, Jenna finally let herself breathe. She locked the door behind her and sat down at the kitchen table, spreading out the papers she'd found. The note, the map, the inventory, all of it seemed to point to a deliberate plan. But what plan? And why did it involve keeping a boy quiet? Jenna rubbed her temples, trying to piece it together. Rachel would need to see these, and maybe Margaret, too. If there were records about the cabin's past, they might hold the key to understanding what was happening now. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Jenna felt more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She might not have all the answers yet, but she wasn't going to stop searching. Something about this land, this cabin, this well, It all felt connected. And with Rusty at her side, she knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. Jenna spent the next morning reviewing the papers she had found at the cabin. The handwritten note with its cryptic instructions, the map with its curious markings, the old inventory list. She laid them all out on the kitchen table, tracing the words and lines with her fingers, trying to make sense of it all. The note's brief phrases, "Check the stream, keep the boy quiet," played on a loop in her mind. She couldn't stop wondering if it all had something to do with Ethan's mysterious presence in the well. The more she studied the map, the more certain she became that the markings weren't random. The cabin sat at the center, but the X's scattered throughout the surrounding woods seemed to indicate specific points of interest. Jenna leaned closer, following the lines with her finger. A stream was marked to the east of the cabin, and several of the X's were clustered along its banks. Another marking near the bottom of the map caught her eye. What looked like a faint, scribbled word next to one of the X's. She squinted at it, trying to make out the letters. "Trunk," she murmured. Was it referring to a tree trunk? A storage trunk? Rusty, curled up on the floor by her feet, perked his ears at the sound of her voice. Jenna reached down to give him a reassuring pat. "Guess we're going to have to do some more exploring, boy." Before she could set out, though, her phone buzzed on the table. It was Rachel. "Hey," Rachel said when Jenna answered. "I've been going through the property records and old deeds like I said I would. Found a couple of things you might find interesting. Can I swing by?" "Sure," Jenna said, feeling a spark of hope. "What did you find?" "I'll explain when I get there," Rachel replied. "It's easier to show you." Less than an hour later, Rachel arrived with a folder stuffed with papers. She spread them out next to Jenna's finds, creating a makeshift archive of notes, maps, and official-looking documents. "Okay," Rachel began. "This cabin doesn't show up on any modern maps, but I found a mention of it in an old land survey from the early 1900s. Back then, it was listed as a caretaker's residence, part of a larger estate that included the farmhouse." "A caretaker's residence?" Jenna asked, leaning over to examine the survey Rachel pointed to. The handwriting was ornate, the ink faded but still legible. It described the cabin as a small dwelling for groundskeeping staff, along with a few notes about the property boundaries. "Exactly," Rachel said. "But here's where it gets weird. The estate changed hands a couple of times over the decades, and each time, the cabin's mention gets more vague. By the 1950s, it's not listed on the official property maps anymore, and by the 1970s, it's like it never existed. I had to dig into some old county archives to even find this." Jenna frowned. Why would it be erased from the records? Rachel shrugged. "No idea, but the fact that it was there then wasn't, well, it makes you wonder if someone didn't want it known." Jenna stared at the old survey. "This place is full of secrets," she muttered. "And I've got one more," Rachel said, pulling out another sheet. "This is from a local newspaper article from the 1980s. It mentions a family that lived here briefly, just a single line in a column about the farm being up for sale. It says, 'Former owners report their young son's disappearance while exploring the woods.' That's all it says. No follow-up, no details, just a mention that a kid went missing and was never found." Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. A kid went missing out there? And no one talked about it again? "Not that I could find," Rachel said. "It might have been chalked up to a tragic accident, or maybe the family didn't want to talk about it. But when I read that, I immediately thought of Ethan. It's just strange." Strange didn't begin to cover it, Jenna thought. She thanked Rachel and promised to keep her updated. Once her friend left, she returned her attention to the map. The word trunk next to one of the X's nagged at her. If there really was some sort of storage trunk out there, it might hold more clues. Jenna decided to start with the stream. It was the most clearly marked feature on the map, and a cluster of X's near it seemed like a logical place to begin. She packed a small bag with a water bottle, a flashlight, and a notebook, and headed out with Rusty. The woods were quiet, the late morning sunlight filtering through the trees. Jenna followed the map's rough guide, her boots crunching softly on the forest floor. Rusty walked ahead, occasionally pausing to sniff the air or investigate a bush. When they reached the stream, Jenna was struck by how peaceful it was. The water flowed clear and steady, its surface dappled with sunlight. The banks were lined with smooth stones, mossy logs, and clusters of wildflowers. But as she looked closer, she noticed something odd. The ground near the stream was disturbed, as if someone had dug into it recently. Rusty sniffed at the spot, then looked back at Jenna. She knelt down and brushed away some of the loose dirt. Her fingers hit something hard. Wood. She dug a little more, revealing the edge of a weathered wooden box. Heart pounding, Jenna carefully unearthed the box and set it on the ground. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, with a rusted metal latch. The wood was damp and discolored, but it still held together. She hesitated, then opened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of items that seemed both mundane and deeply personal. There were a few small toys, a wooden spinning top, a set of marbles, a tiny tin soldier. Beneath those was a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were old, the paper yellowed and fragile. Jenna carefully untied the ribbon and opened one of the letters. The handwriting was delicate, the ink faded but readable. It was addressed to "My dearest Michael," and spoke of missing him, of hoping he was safe. The letters mentioned a child, though never by name, and referred to "our boy" and keeping him hidden until it's safe. The back of Jenna's neck prickled. Keeping him hidden? From what? She read another letter, then another. They spoke of fear, of waiting for the right moment to leave, of trusting no one. It was clear that whoever had written them was terrified. And then, in the final letter, the tone shifted. The writer spoke of running out of time, of having no choice but to leave without the boy. Jenna's stomach turned. She placed the letters back in the box and sat back on her heels, staring at the stream. Someone had tried to keep a child safe, hidden even. And then they had to abandon him. She thought of Ethan, of the boy from the 1980s who had disappeared. Was this connected? Could these letters be a piece of that same story? Rusty barked suddenly, pulling Jenna from her thoughts. She looked up to see him standing a few feet away, his ears pricked and his tail stiff. He let out another bark, then started to trot toward a cluster of trees. "Rusty, what is it?" Jenna called, quickly closing the box and following him. The dog led her to a large, hollow tree near the stream. He sniffed around the base, then poked his nose into the hollow, wagging his tail. Jenna peered inside and saw something glinting in the sunlight. She reached in and pulled out an old metal container. It was heavier than she expected and had a simple, sturdy clasp. When she opened it, she found a stack of photographs. The photos were black and white, slightly faded, but still clear enough to see the faces. Jenna recognized the farmhouse, the cabin, the woods. But it was the people in the photos that made her heart race. A man, a woman, and a young boy. The same boy appeared in several photos, smiling shyly at the camera. The man and woman looked serious, as if they were trying to appear calm for the photograph, but were hiding some inner turmoil. Jenna flipped through the photos, looking for anything that might provide more information. On the back of one, she found a date, 1974. Another photo had a single name written on the back, Ethan. Jenna's hands shook. Ethan. The boy's name was Ethan. She sank down onto a nearby log, holding the photos tightly. Rusty sat beside her, his warm presence grounding her as her thoughts raced. The letters, the map, the photographs. Everything seemed to point to the same story. A boy named Ethan, hidden away, and a family that disappeared. But what did it mean for the Ethan she had rescued? Was he connected to this earlier story, or was it just a strange coincidence? Jenna didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done searching. She'd keep following the clues, keep digging into the history of the cabin and the people who lived there. The truth was out there, and she was determined to find it. That night, Jenna couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts circling around the day's discoveries. The letters, the photographs, the mention of Ethan. Everything felt so interconnected, and yet she still didn't have the full picture. Rusty, usually content to curl up at her feet, seemed restless too. He got up several times, pacing by the door, his claws clicking softly on the wooden floor. Each time, Jenna told herself she'd get up in a moment, but instead she stayed in bed, hoping that if she lay still long enough, the pieces might fall into place. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through her curtains, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let the mystery linger any longer. She would return to the cabin, follow the map, and explore every marked spot if she had to. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. With a fresh sense of determination, Jenna prepared for the day ahead. She packed a small backpack with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a notebook to jot down any new findings. She double-checked the map she'd found at the cabin, tracing the path to each X-marked location with her finger. The word trunk still stood out, teasing her with its ambiguity. What kind of trunk? And why had it been important enough to mark? As she stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted her. The world felt quiet and new, as if it, too, was holding its breath in anticipation. Rusty was already waiting by the porch steps, his tail wagging and his ears alert. Jenna smiled and gave him a reassuring pat. "All right, boy, let's see what else we can find." They headed toward the woods, following the now familiar path to the cabin. Jenna's steps were quicker today, her resolve stronger. The cabin came into view, still as weathered and foreboding as ever. She didn't linger there this time. Instead, she consulted the map and made her way east toward the stream. Rusty trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, occasionally looking back as if to make sure she was keeping up. The first X-marked spot wasn't far from the stream. When they reached it, Jenna paused, looking around carefully. The ground here seemed undisturbed, just a patch of forest like any other. She crouched down, brushing aside fallen leaves and twigs. Beneath them, she found a faint depression in the earth, as if something had been buried there long ago. Jenna took out a small hand trowel from her backpack and began to dig. The soil was loose, making it easier to work quickly. After a few minutes, her trowel hit something solid. She cleared away more dirt, revealing a wooden crate, its edges worn and its surface darkened with age. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out of the hole. The crate was heavy and bound with rusted metal bands. Rusty sat beside her, watching intently as she pried the lid open. Inside, she found an assortment of items that seemed to belong to another era: a set of old tools, a few glass bottles, and a tin filled with yellowed papers. Jenna carefully unfolded one of the papers, revealing what appeared to be an inventory list. The handwriting was the same as the letters she had found earlier. This list, however, included several curious entries: provisions for travel, extra blankets, trunk contents secured. The mention of the trunk sent a shiver through her. If this was the same trunk mentioned on the map, it might hold something more significant than a few old supplies. She placed the papers back in the crate and stood up, scanning the surrounding woods. There were more X's on the map, and she needed to find them. Rusty led the way again, guiding her further along the stream. The forest grew denser as they moved east, the trees taller and the underbrush thicker. Jenna checked the map frequently, marking her progress as they approached the next location. This time, the ground was rocky, and the X was near a large boulder. She searched around it, looking for any signs of disturbance. It was Rusty who found it first. The dog pawed at a spot near the base of the boulder, his tail wagging furiously. Jenna knelt down and brushed the dirt aside. There, nestled among the rocks, was another small metal box. This one was lighter than the crate, but the latch was rusted shut. She worked it open carefully, revealing a collection of photographs and a small leather-bound journal. The photographs were similar to the ones she had found earlier: black and white images of the farmhouse, the cabin, and a family. The boy, Ethan, appeared in several of them, his expression solemn yet curious. The journal, on the other hand, held something entirely new. It was written by someone who referred to themselves as HJ, and it chronicled the daily life of the farm and its caretakers. Jenna skimmed the entries, her heart racing. The journal spoke of a growing tension, of visitors coming to the cabin late at night, of whispers about hiding the boy. One entry in particular caught her attention. "The trunk has been moved to the southern grove. It's no longer safe here. We must be prepared to leave at a moment's notice." Jenna glanced at the map again. The southern grove was marked with yet another X. If the trunk was there, it might finally provide the answers she needed. She placed the journal and photographs back in the box, secured it in her backpack, and set off with Rusty toward the grove. The grove was further than she expected. The trees grew closer together here, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Jenna pushed through the underbrush, Rusty staying close by her side. When they reached the marked spot, she stopped and took a deep breath. The ground was uneven, with patches of moss covering large roots and fallen logs. Jenna began to search, her eyes scanning every inch of the grove. It wasn't long before she noticed something unusual: a patch of soil that looked darker and more compact than the surrounding area. She knelt down and started digging. Her heart pounded as her trowel hit wood. She cleared away the soil, revealing the top of an old iron-bound trunk. Her hands shook as she brushed away the last of the dirt. The trunk was large, its metal clasps heavily rusted. Jenna took a moment to steady herself before attempting to open it. The clasps resisted at first, but with a bit of effort, she managed to pry them loose. The lid creaked as it opened, revealing the trunk's contents. Inside, she found bundles of old clothing, neatly folded and wrapped in cloth. Beneath them were more letters, photographs, and several small leather pouches. One pouch contained coins, old, worn currency from decades past. Another held what looked like family heirlooms: a locket, a signet ring, and a delicate bracelet. But it was the letters that drew Jenna's attention. She pulled out a stack of them, bound with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was familiar, the same as the letters she had found before. She began reading, her breath catching at the words. The letters described a family's attempt to flee an unspecified danger, their efforts to protect their son, and the sacrifices they had to make to keep him safe. One letter, dated just days before the boy's disappearance, read, "We cannot wait any longer. They are closing in. The boy must stay hidden until we can secure passage. If we fail, he will need to be strong enough to find his own way." Jenna's hands tightened around the letter. This was it. This was the connection she had been looking for. The boy in these letters, Ethan, was the same boy from the photographs. He had been left behind, hidden, while his family tried to escape some unknown threat. And now, all these years later, another Ethan had been found in the well. Rusty nudged her arm, bringing her back to the present. She looked at him, his brown eyes full of trust and loyalty. "You've led me this far," she said softly, "and I think we're finally getting close to the truth." Jenna carefully packed the letters and items back into the trunk, leaving everything as undisturbed as possible. She closed the lid and stood, taking one last look at the grove. It felt heavy with history, the air thick with the echoes of the past. She glanced at the map one more time, noting the remaining X's. There were still a few more places to check, a few more pieces of the puzzle to uncover. As she and Rusty began the trek back home, Jenna felt a renewed sense of purpose. The story wasn't finished yet, and neither was her search for answers. Back at the farmhouse, Jenna spread out her findings on the kitchen table. The letters, photographs, and maps all formed a patchwork of clues, but there were still so many unanswered questions. She studied the documents late into the night, jotting down notes and marking connections between the items. It was like piecing together a story that had been hidden for decades, buried under layers of time and secrecy. Rusty lay nearby, his head resting on his paws as he watched Jenna work. She glanced at him every now and then, his calm presence reminding her that she wasn't alone in this strange journey. He had led her this far, and she trusted his instincts completely. As the hours passed, a pattern began to emerge from the scattered information. The letters spoke of a desperate attempt to protect a child named Ethan, to keep him safe from an unspecified threat. The photographs showed a family on the farm, their expressions guarded yet determined. The maps indicated hiding spots and paths through the woods, suggesting a plan for escape or concealment. And then there were the references to the trunk, a crucial piece of the puzzle that seemed to hold the key to their intentions. Jenna felt a deep sense of empathy for the family. They had been living under constant fear, doing whatever they could to keep their son safe. But from what? What had driven them to take such extreme measures? She wished she had more context, more details about the dangers they faced. In the midst of her thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was Rachel. Jenna picked it up quickly, eager for any additional information her friend might have uncovered. "Hey, Jenna," Rachel said. "I just found something in the county archives that might interest you. It's an old incident report from the sheriff's office, dated the same year as that missing boy article I mentioned. It says there were reports of strangers spotted near the farm. The details are vague, but it sounds like the family had been worried about these people showing up." Jenna's heart raced. What kind of strangers? Does it say who they were or why they were there? "Not exactly," Rachel said. The report just mentions suspicious individuals seen on the property at night. The sheriff checked it out a few times but never found anyone. The family claimed these strangers were watching them, but there wasn't enough evidence to make a case. Eventually, the reports stopped, and that was the end of it. Jenna stared at the letters spread out before her. That lines up with what I've been finding. The family must have been scared enough to go into hiding. They had to leave the boy behind, hoping they'd be able to come back for him. But it sounds like they never got the chance. That's my guess too, Rachel said. It's so sad. And it makes me wonder, what happened to those strangers? Why did they stop coming around? I don't know, Jenna said softly. But it's another piece of the puzzle. Thanks, Rachel. Let me know if you find anything else. After hanging up, Jenna turned back to her notes. The sheriff's report added a new dimension to the story. The family's fear hadn't been unfounded. Someone, or several people, had been after them. But why? What could they possibly have had that was worth pursuing? Jenna decided she needed to revisit the remaining X-marked locations on the map. There were still a few spots she hadn't checked, and if the family had hidden more items or documents, those might provide the answers she was looking for. She gathered her gear, called Rusty to her side, and headed out again. The next location was west of the cabin, in a dense section of woods where the trees stood like silent sentinels. The map indicated a clearing, but it wasn't easy to find. Jenna pushed through thick underbrush and ducked under low-hanging branches, relying on Rusty's keen senses to guide her. Finally, the trees opened up to a small, circular clearing bathed in dappled sunlight. In the center of the clearing stood a large, moss-covered rock. Jenna approached it cautiously, scanning the ground for anything unusual. Rusty sniffed around the base of the rock, then barked once, his tail wagging. Jenna knelt down and began brushing away leaves and dirt. It didn't take long to uncover another hidden container, this time a sturdy metal box with a heavy lock. She tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she examined the box for any clues. There was an inscription etched into the lid, faded but still visible. It read, "For safekeeping until our return." Jenna's mind raced. Safekeeping. Until our return. The family had planned to come back for this, but they never did. She picked up the box, determined to find a way to open it later, and headed back toward the farmhouse. Once home, Jenna sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the locked box. She felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. What would she find inside? And would it finally provide the answers she'd been searching for? Rusty lay at her feet, his steady presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. Jenna reached down to scratch behind his ears, whispering, "We're getting closer, boy. I can feel it." The day turned into evening, and Jenna's thoughts remained fixed on the mystery that had consumed her life. The locked box, the letters, the maps, the sheriff's report, all of it painted a picture of a family who had lived in fear, who had done everything they could to protect their child. But the full story still eluded her. And so, she resolved to keep searching, to follow the trail wherever it led, until she finally uncovered the truth. The next morning, Jenna woke early, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. She spent an hour rereading the letters and examining the photographs she'd uncovered, hoping to notice some detail she might have missed. The mention of agents, retrieval, and containment loomed heavy in her thoughts. What had Ethan's family been trying so desperately to protect him from? Jenna decided she needed to investigate the remaining X's on the map. She packed her backpack with supplies: water, a flashlight, her notebook, and set out with Rusty. The dog was as eager as ever, trotting ahead on the path and occasionally looking back as if urging her to hurry. The first marked location of the day was a clearing near a cluster of large rocks. When Jenna arrived, she immediately began searching for anything out of place. At first glance, it seemed like just another patch of forest floor, moss-covered stones, fallen branches, and scattered leaves. But as Jenna walked around, Rusty started sniffing at a patch of ground near the largest boulder. He barked once, then began pawing at the earth. Jenna knelt down and started digging with her hands. Within moments, she uncovered a small wooden crate, partially rotted but still intact. Inside, she found another bundle of letters and a few small personal items: a child's tin whistle, a handmade doll, and a pair of gloves that looked like they might fit a young boy. The letters were in the same handwriting as the ones she had read before, filled with expressions of love and concern. One letter stood out. "We have no choice but to move quickly. They know about the boy. We can only pray that by the time they arrive, we will be gone. If you find this, Ethan, know that we did everything we could." The sense of urgency in the words gave Jenna a chill. She carefully rewrapped the letters and placed them back in the crate, then marked the location on her map. Rusty wagged his tail, ready to move on to the next spot. They continued their journey through the woods, visiting each remaining X and uncovering more fragments of the family's story. One spot revealed an old suitcase filled with clothes and a few books. Another held a metal tin containing ration cards and what appeared to be old medical records. As Jenna pieced together these finds, a narrative began to form. The family had been pursued, not just by unknown agents, but by a larger, more insidious force. The references to retrieval and containment suggested that Ethan had some quality, something unique, that made him a target. His parents had done everything they could to keep him hidden, but their options had run out. They had been forced to leave him behind, hoping he would be safe, and that one day he might understand their decision. Jenna sat on a fallen log in one of the clearings, the weight of the story heavy on her shoulders. Rusty sat beside her, his warm presence a small comfort. She wondered if Ethan had ever found these letters, these small caches of belongings. Had he grown up knowing the truth? Or had he remained in the dark, never fully understanding why his family had disappeared? That thought stayed with her as she returned home that evening. She spread out all the items on her kitchen table, organizing them by date and content. The documents, the photographs, the letters. Together, they painted a picture of a family caught in an impossible situation. They had loved their son deeply and had risked everything to keep him safe. But in the end, they had been forced to let him go. Jenna couldn't help but think of the Ethan she had rescued from the well. Was he connected to this story? Could he be a descendant of the family? Or was it simply a coincidence that he shared the same name? She wished she could ask him, but the boy had been taken to a nearby town for medical care and was now staying with a foster family. Jenna had only been able to visit him once, and while he had seemed to be recovering, he hadn't spoken much about his past. One evening, Jenna received a call from Rachel. "I've been digging through more archives," Rachel said. "There's something you should see." Jenna drove over to Rachel's house, where her friend had spread out several old newspapers and county records. Rachel pointed to a headline from the late 1970s. "Local family disappears amid allegations of secret experimentation." The article was short on details, but it mentioned a government-funded research project and a boy described as special or unusual. They never named the family, Rachel said, but it's hard not to draw a connection. This could be Ethan's family. Jenna read the article carefully. The implication was clear. Someone had been interested in Ethan, not just as a child, but as a subject. Whether it was his health, his genetics, or something else entirely, he had been the focus of unwanted attention. His parents had done everything in their power to protect him, but in the end, they had been forced to make a choice. Jenna felt a wave of sorrow for the family, for the sacrifices they had made, and the uncertainty they must have faced. With Rachel's help, Jenna began contacting historians, archivists, and anyone who might have more information about the events described in the article. The process was slow and often frustrating, but little by little, more details emerged. It turned out that the research project had been quietly shut down decades ago, and many of the records had been sealed. Still, a few former employees had come forward over the years, hinting at ethical breaches and cover-ups. One retired researcher agreed to speak with Jenna and Rachel off the record. Over coffee at a quiet diner, he recounted vague memories of a boy who had been different. He wouldn't elaborate on what made the boy unique, but he confirmed that the family had been under pressure to cooperate. "They didn't trust us," he said, "and I don't blame them. They just wanted to keep their son safe." As Jenna listened, she felt a mix of anger and sadness. The family had been treated as pawns in a larger game, their lives upended by forces beyond their control. Yet, despite everything, they had managed to shield their son, at least for a time. Back at the farmhouse, Jenna sat at the kitchen table once more, Rusty lying at her feet. The story she had pieced together was one of love, sacrifice, and resilience. She thought about the Ethan she had saved, wondering if he would ever learn about the family who had come before him. Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was safe now, free from the shadows that had haunted his predecessors. As she prepared for bed that night, Jenna felt a sense of closure. She didn't have all the answers, but she had done her best to uncover the truth and honor the memory of the family who had once lived on her land. She glanced at Rusty, who had already curled up on his blanket. "You've been with me every step of the way," she whispered. "Thank you, boy." Rusty thumped his tail in response, and Jenna smiled. She didn't need every detail to be resolved. Sometimes, it was enough to know that love and determination could leave a legacy that no one could erase. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt at peace, knowing she had played a small part in preserving that legacy.